My name is Megan Carter. I'm 31 years old and I work as an accounting supervisor for a manufacturing company just outside Columbus, Ohio. I've always been the type of person who believes that if you mind your own business and treat your neighbours with respect, life stays pretty peaceful. For almost 12 years, that philosophy worked perfectly, until one man moved onto our street and somehow turned an entire neighbourhood into his personal courtroom. The funny thing is, this story isn't really about me. It's about my dad. He's 64 years old, retired from the local fire department, and probably the calmest person I've ever known. Growing up, my dad had one rule that never changed. If it isn't hurting anybody, leave people alone. He never complained about loud music, never argued over property lines, never cared what colour someone painted their house. As long as people respected each other, he believed everyone should be free to live however they wanted. Unfortunately, our new neighbour believed the exact opposite, and by the time everything was over, half of his brand new garage was sitting in a construction dumpster. It all started about a year ago. The house across from my parents had been empty for months after the previous owners moved to Florida. Everyone on the street loved the old couple who had lived there. They waved at everyone, brought cookies over every Christmas, helped shovel snow whenever someone was sick. When they left, we all hoped another friendly family would move in. Instead, we got Richard. Nobody knew much about him. He looked to be somewhere in his late 50s, always dressed neatly, always driving the same spotless black SUV. The first weekend after moving in, he didn't introduce himself to anyone. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. Instead, he spent most of Saturday slowly walking around the neighbourhood, not exercising, not walking a dog, just looking. He'd stop at people's yards, stare for a few seconds, then continue walking. At first, everyone assumed he was simply getting familiar with the neighbourhood. Looking back, I think he was inspecting it. The first complaint happened less than 2 weeks later. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived on our street for nearly 30 years, received a notice from the Homeowners Association because someone reported that her garbage cans had been visible from the street for 2 days. She laughed about it. Who on earth has time to notice something like that? A few days later, Mr. Alvarez mentioned someone had complained about his work van being parked in front of his own house overnight. Then another neighbour got a warning because weeds had started growing around an old mailbox. Little things, petty things, nothing serious, but they kept happening. And strangely, every complaint started after Richard arrived. Nobody could prove it, but nobody believed it was a coincidence either. Whenever neighbours gathered outside on warm evenings, the conversation slowly became predictable. I got another notice. He reported my fence. He complained about my trailer. He called the HOA again. Richard never admitted anything. He simply smiled politely whenever people brought it up, then changed the subject. My dad refused to get involved. Some people just enjoy complaining, he'd say. Ignore them. And for a while, that's exactly what everyone tried to do. One Saturday afternoon, I was helping my dad clean out his garage. It had become our tradition after he retired. I'd come over once or twice a month. We'd organise tools, fix little things around the house, then grill burgers afterward. That afternoon, I noticed Richard standing across the street. He wasn't doing yard work. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply watching my dad measure a few boards, watching me carry old paint cans to the truck, watching everything. After several minutes, I finally laughed. "Dad, I think your biggest fan is staring again." Dad glanced across the street. Sure enough. Richard immediately looked away. Dad shrugged. Maybe he's just curious. I wasn't convinced. There was curiosity, and then there was whatever Richard seemed to be doing. Because he wasn't looking at people. He was looking for something. Something he could criticize. Something he could report. Something that wasn't exactly right. About a month later, he found what he thought was the perfect opportunity. One Tuesday morning, while Dad was drinking coffee on the back patio, his phone rang. It was someone from the city. They explained that a complaint had been filed regarding the driveway extension along the side of his house. According to the complaint, the concrete had supposedly been poured without permits and violated city regulations. Dad thanked the woman on the phone and calmly wrote down the inspection date. When he hung up, he just sat there, quietly for a moment. I happened to call him later that afternoon. He sounded different. Not angry, just disappointed. "Everything okay?" I asked. He hesitated. "Someone reported the driveway." "What?" "The city has to come inspect it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That driveway extension had been there for years, long before Richard ever moved into the neighbourhood. Dad had hired a licensed contractor, pulled every required permit, passed every inspection. The project had been completely legal from beginning to end. So why would someone report it? Dad sighed. I think we both know why. Neither of us actually said Richard's name. We didn't have to, because deep down, there was only one person on our street who seemed determined to turn everyone else's home into his personal investigation. Still, Dad refused to accuse anyone. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. Maybe. But somehow, I didn't think misunderstandings usually came with perfect timing, and I had a feeling this wasn't going to be the last time Richard pointed the city's attention towards someone else's property. Little did he know, he had just taught me something incredibly valuable. If you know where to look. Public records can tell some very interesting stories. The city inspector arrived the following Thursday morning. Dad had already pulled a thick manila folder from the filing cabinet in his home office before the inspector even knocked on the door. When I stopped by that morning, the folder was already sitting on the kitchen table. Inside were neatly organised documents dating back almost 8 years. The original contractor's proposal, the building permit, the approved site plan, inspection reports, final approval paperwork, even the cancelled cheque Dad had written to the contractor. I smiled. You kept all of this? Dad looked almost surprised by the question. Of course. You never know when paperwork might save you. At the time, I laughed. Later, I'd realised those words would end up changing everything. A few minutes later, a white city pickup truck pulled into the driveway. The inspector stepped out, carrying a tablet and a measuring wheel. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s, professional, friendly. The kind of person who had probably inspected hundreds of properties every year. Dad walked outside before the man even reached the porch. Morning? The inspector smiled. Morning, sir. I'm here regarding a complaint about your driveway extension. Dad nodded. I figured. I've got all the paperwork ready if you'd like to see it. The inspector chuckled. I wish everyone made my job this easy. For the next 10 minutes, they walked slowly along the side of the house. The inspector measured the width of the concrete, checked property setbacks, compared everything to the approved site plan on his tablet. Dad handed him copies of every permit without being asked twice. The inspector flipped through them quickly before handing them back. Everything looks good. He glanced around one more time. I honestly don't see any issues here. Dad smiled politely. I'm glad to hear it. The inspector tapped a few notes into his tablet. I'll close the complaint this afternoon. You're completely within code. Just like that, the entire investigation was over. 10 minutes, that was all it took. As the inspector drove away, Dad let out a long breath. I hate wasting people's time. You didn't waste anyone's time. The person who filed the complaint did. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he carried the folder back inside and returned every document to the filing cabinet. Watching him carefully slide each paper back into place made me realise something. He hadn't been nervous because he'd done something wrong. He'd been nervous because no one enjoys having the government show up at their house, even when you've done everything correctly. That afternoon, I called to check on him. So, officially cleared? He laughed. Apparently my dangerous driveway is perfectly legal. Imagine that. His sense of humour was back. I figured the whole thing was finally behind us. Unfortunately, Richard didn't seem to feel the same way. A couple of days later, I stopped by to drop off groceries for Dad. As I pulled onto the street, I immediately noticed Richard standing near his mailbox. He wasn't checking the mail. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply watching my dad mow the front lawn. There was something about the expression on his face that immediately bothered me. Not disappointment, not embarrassment, almost expectation. Like he still believed he'd eventually catch someone doing something wrong. Dad waved politely as he pushed the mower across the yard. Richard didn't wave back. He simply turned around and walked into his house. I remember saying quietly, "Does he ever smile?" Dad shut off the mower. "I don't know. I've never really talked to him. Do you think he reported you?" Dad rested both hands on the mower handle. "I honestly can't prove that." But he looked toward Richard's driveway. I'd be surprised if it was anyone else. Then, almost immediately, he shook his head. "It doesn't matter. The city's done. It's over." I wanted to believe him, I really did, but something kept bothering me, not because of the inspection itself, because of the timing. Richard had moved into the neighbourhood. Suddenly complaints started appearing everywhere. Now my dad had been reported. It didn't feel random anymore, it felt like a pattern. That evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting at my laptop. Not because I had some elaborate revenge plan, honestly. I was just curious. I'd never looked at our city's public permit database before. I'd only remembered it existed because the inspector mentioned pulling Dad's approved plans from the system. I typed in Dad's address first. Within seconds, everything appeared. Driveway extension, roof replacement, water heater permit, deck repairs. Every project was neatly listed with dates, permit numbers, inspection records, and final approvals. Exactly what you'd expect from someone who always followed the rules. Out of curiosity, I typed in Richard's address. Several permits appeared. Roof replacement, new furnace, electrical upgrade. Then, nothing. I frowned. That couldn't be right. Because every time I visited Dad, I could clearly see a huge detached garage sitting behind Richard's house. It looked almost brand new, large enough for multiple vehicles, fresh siding, fresh concrete, fresh roof. There was no way that structure had been there for decades. It certainly hadn't existed when the previous owners lived there, so why wasn't it listed? I refreshed the page, searched again. Nothing. Maybe I was searching incorrectly. I opened the county GIS property map instead. The satellite image had been updated recently. There it was, the detached garage, huge, taking up most of the backyard. Then I switched on the parcel boundary layer. Something immediately caught my attention. The garage looked very close to the rear property line, closer than I expected. I wasn't an inspector. I wasn't a contractor, and I definitely wasn't a zoning expert. But after watching Dad go through an inspection over something completely legal, I suddenly found myself asking a very simple question. If my father had to prove every inch of his driveway complied with city rules, had anyone ever checked whether Richard's brand new garage did? I leaned back in my chair. For several minutes, I stared at the screen without moving. Part of me wanted to close the browser and forget the whole thing. After all, curiosity can create problems. But another part of me couldn't ignore what I was looking at. Maybe everything was perfectly legal. Maybe there was a permit filed under another project number. Or maybe Richard had spent months trying to catch everyone else breaking the rules, without realizing he might have skipped a few himself. I closed my laptop, but one thought stayed with me the rest of the night. If public records had protected my dad, maybe they were about to tell me something else, too. The next morning, I tried to convince myself to let it go. Seriously. I had work to do, meetings to attend, emails piling up in my inbox. I told myself I was reading too much into a missing permit. Maybe the city database hadn't been updated. Maybe the garage had been built years ago under the previous owners. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that I simply hadn't found yet. That should have been enough. It almost was. But every time I thought about closing the subject, I remembered my dad standing in his driveway, holding a folder full of permits, just because someone had decided to file a complaint. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet he still had to prove it. That thought stayed with me all day. By the time I finished work, curiosity had quietly turned into something else. Not revenge, not anger, just a desire to know whether everyone on our street was actually being held to the same standard. On my way home, I stopped by my parents' house. Dad was outside, watering the flowers along the front porch. When he saw me, he smiled. "What brings you over?" I was nearby. That wasn't entirely true. I wanted another look at Richard's garage. Not from inside Dad's yard, from the public sidewalk. After chatting with Dad for a few minutes, I casually walked toward the end of the driveway. The sidewalk ran directly past both properties. Everything I looked at could be seen by anyone walking down the street. I wasn't climbing fences. I wasn't taking shortcuts through anyone's yard. I simply kept walking. As I passed Richard's house, I slowed down for a moment. The detached garage was even larger than I'd remembered. Fresh grey siding, dark shingles that still looked new, brand new concrete apron leading up to the garage doors. It definitely hadn't been standing there for decades. From where I stood, I could also see something else. The back corner of the garage looked incredibly close to the fence. Closer than most detached garages I'd seen. Again, I wasn't a building inspector. Maybe it was perfectly legal. Maybe it only looked close because of the angle. Still, I pulled out my phone. Not to photograph his backyard, not to zoom into his windows, just a few pictures from the sidewalk showing the garage, the driveway, and the visible property lines. Nothing more. As I slipped my phone back into my pocket, I actually felt a little ridiculous. What am I doing? I muttered to myself. This wasn't like me. I'd never reported a neighbour before. I'd never even considered it. Growing up, my parents had always taught me the same lesson. Mind your own business. Don't start unnecessary conflicts. Treat people the way you'd like to be treated. Those values mattered to me. They still do. Which is exactly why I didn't file anything that day. Instead, I drove home, made dinner, fed Oliver, then opened my laptop again. This time, I decided to dig a little deeper. I searched the county parcel records, then the city's planning department, then archived aerial photographs available through the county GIS website. The oldest image I could find was only a few years old. There was no detached garage, just an open backyard. That confirmed one thing. The structure was relatively new. I went back to the permit database one more time. Different spelling, different address format, parcel number instead of street address. Still nothing. No detached garage, no accessory building permit, no zoning approval. Nothing. I leaned back in my chair. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe permits were stored somewhere else. I even searched the city's website for information about detached garages. The requirements were surprisingly clear. Anything over a certain size required permits. New detached structures had setback requirements from property lines, inspections, final approval. The rules were all publicly available. I wasn't looking for loopholes. I was simply reading exactly what any homeowner could read. For several minutes, I stared at the screen. Then I asked myself one simple question. If Richard believed my dad deserved a city inspection, was it really unfair to ask the city to verify whether his own construction met the same standards? That question bothered me, because I genuinely didn't enjoy the answer. I wasn't looking for revenge. If the city came out and told me everything was permitted and perfectly legal, great. I'd actually be relieved. At least then I'd know everyone was being treated equally. I closed my laptop, walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, then came back and sat down again. My cursor hovered over the city's online reporting form. I must have stared at that screen for nearly 10 minutes. The form wasn't dramatic. It didn't ask for opinions. It didn't ask whether I liked my neighbour. It simply asked for an address, a description of the concern, and any supporting information. I typed in Richard's address, then stopped. My fingers rested on the keyboard. I could still close the browser, forget the whole thing, go on with my life. Nobody would ever know I'd even considered it. But then another image came back to me. My dad, standing calmly beside the inspector, holding years' worth of paperwork, simply because someone else had decided to question his honesty. I took a slow breath, then I typed one sentence. I was unable to locate permits for what appears to be a recently constructed detached garage. I believe the structure may also be very close to the rear property line. I would appreciate it if the city could verify whether the construction complies with current permit and setback requirements. That was it. No insults, no accusations, no exaggeration. I attached the parcel number, added the photographs I'd taken from the public sidewalk, read everything one final time, then I clicked submit. As soon as the confirmation page appeared, I closed my laptop. I remember thinking, whatever happens next, it's no longer my decision. Now it belongs to the city. After I submitted the report, life went back to normal. Or at least, it looked like it had. The city never emailed me. No one called. There wasn't even an automatic update telling me whether the complaint had been assigned to an inspector. Just a confirmation number. That was it. To be honest, I almost forgot about it. Work became busy. We were approaching the end of the quarter and my office was buried in financial reports. By the time I got home each evening, the last thing I wanted to think about was permit records or detached garages. Dad never mentioned Richard again either. Whenever I stopped by his house, we talked about normal things. His vegetable garden, baseball, whether Ohio was ever going to get a break from the rain. It almost felt like the entire neighborhood had settled down again. Richard was still Richard. He still walked the neighborhood almost every evening, still glanced into people's yards as he passed, still seemed unusually interested in everyone else's property, but there were fewer complaints floating around. Or maybe people had simply stopped talking about them. Either way, the street felt peaceful again. Then, almost exactly 3 weeks later, Dad called me just after 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. I answered during my coffee break. "Hey, Dad." "You'll never guess who's parked across the street." I smiled. "Amazon?" He laughed. "No. City inspection." I immediately sat up straighter. "What?" "They're at Richard's house." For a second, neither of us said anything. I knew exactly what that probably meant. Dad didn't. He simply sounded curious. They've been walking around his backyard for almost 20 minutes. I glanced at the clock. "I've got lunch in an hour." "I'm coming over," Dad chuckled. "I figured you might." By the time I reached my parents' neighborhood, the city truck was still there. I parked in Dad's driveway, like I always did. From where we stood near his front porch, we couldn't hear what anyone was saying, but we could see enough. The inspector wasn't alone. Another city employee had arrived. One carried a clipboard, the other had a large, rolled-up set of plans tucked under one arm. Richard looked different. Gone was the confident man who always seemed to have an opinion about everyone else's property. Now he looked confused, concerned. Every few minutes he pointed toward the garage while the inspectors wrote notes. Then one of them pulled out a tape measure. They measured one side, then another, then walked over to the rear fence. Dad squinted. "They're measuring something." I noticed. Neither of us moved. Neither of us wanted to look like we were spying. We simply stood in Dad's yard, talking quietly while occasionally glancing across the street. After nearly 40 minutes, the inspectors finally gathered everything together. One of them handed Richard a packet of papers. Even from that distance, his shoulders visibly dropped. He read the first page, looked back toward the garage, then asked several questions. The inspector answered calmly. Richard shook his head. The conversation lasted another 5 minutes before both inspectors climbed back into their truck and drove away. Dad looked at me. I wonder what that was about. I shrugged as casually as I could. No idea. It wasn't technically a lie. I didn't know what they'd found, only why they had probably come. Dad changed the subject almost immediately. "Want some lunch?" "Sure." That was one thing I always appreciated about him. He didn't enjoy neighbourhood gossip. He wasn't standing there hoping Richard had gotten into trouble. As far as Dad was concerned, whatever happened across the street was Richard's business. We spent the next hour eating sandwiches and talking about baseball. Eventually, I drove home, still wondering, had they found permits? Had everything been perfectly legal after all? Maybe I'd been completely wrong. Honestly, part of me hoped I had been. Because despite everything, I wasn't trying to get anyone into trouble. I only wanted one thing, for the rules to apply equally. That evening, as I was washing dishes, my phone buzzed. It was Dad. Richard's been outside pacing for the last hour. Really? Yeah. I've never seen him this nervous. I looked out my own apartment window, even though there was nothing to see. What do you think happened? Dad laughed softly. I have absolutely no idea. If I had to guess, they probably found something that needs fixing? That was exactly what I was wondering, but neither of us knew. Not yet. Days passed, then another week. No construction, no city trucks, no obvious changes. Richard barely came outside anymore. When he did, he walked straight from his front door to his SUV without stopping to inspect anyone else's yard. It was strange. The man who had always seemed so interested in everybody else's property suddenly appeared determined not to make eye contact with anyone. I started thinking maybe the issue had already been resolved. Maybe he'd simply been asked to file paperwork after the fact. Maybe he'd pay a fine. Maybe nothing major would happen at all. Then, one Friday afternoon, Dad called again. This time, his first sentence made me set my coffee down before he even finished speaking. Megan, you should probably come over. Why? There are 3 contractor trucks parked in front of Richard's house, and they're tearing his garage apart. I don't think I've ever driven to my parents' house that quickly. Of course, I stayed within the speed limit, but the entire drive my mind kept replaying Dad's last sentence. They're tearing his garage apart. Part of me wondered if he had misunderstood. Maybe they were renovating it. Maybe they were replacing the roof. Maybe it had nothing to do with the inspection at all. By the time I turned onto my parents' street, I realised he hadn't exaggerated anything. 3 contractor trucks were parked in front of Richard's house. A trailer sat at the curb, already filled with broken pieces of siding and lumber. Orange safety cones surrounded the driveway, and standing in the middle of it all was Richard. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't arguing, he just stood there with both hands on his hips, silently watching the workers. Dad was sitting on his front porch. The moment he saw me pull into the driveway, he smiled. Told you. I walked over and sat beside him. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply watched. The contractors worked with remarkable efficiency. One crew removed sections of the roof. Another carefully dismantled the rear wall. A third loaded debris into the trailer waiting at the curb. It didn't look chaotic. It looked planned, almost surgical. Finally, Dad broke the silence. I asked one of the workers what happened. You did? He nodded. I figured if they're parked on a public street, there's no harm in asking. What did he say? Dad looked back toward the garage. He couldn't tell me much. But apparently the city required modifications before they'd approve the structure. That matched what I'd suspected. Required modifications. Not optional. Required. I watched another section of the garage wall disappear. The building suddenly looked oddly unfinished, like someone had sliced a piece off with a giant knife. Dad shook his head slowly. That's got to be expensive. I imagine so. Again. There was no satisfaction in his voice, no smugness, no celebration, just sympathy. That's the kind of person my father has always been. Even when someone creates their own problems, his first instinct is usually to feel sorry for them. Mine was a little more complicated. I wasn't happy someone was losing part of a building. Construction isn't cheap, neither are contractors. I could only imagine how much money Richard had already spent building that garage, and now he was paying people to tear part of it back down. That had to hurt, financially and emotionally. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about something. Dad had spent years carefully saving every permit, every inspection report, every receipt, because he believed following the rules mattered. Richard apparently hadn't. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. As we sat there, one of the contractors backed away from the structure. The rear corner of the garage was now completely gone. You could see straight through to the backyard. The remaining section looked strangely uneven, functional, but no longer the massive building it had been only a few days earlier. Dad quietly said, "I wonder why he didn't just get permits in the first place." I shrugged. I've been wondering the same thing. Neither of us actually knew. Maybe he thought nobody would notice. Maybe he assumed he could always get approval later. Maybe someone gave him bad advice. Whatever the reason, the city clearly wasn't willing to overlook it. Later that afternoon, after most of the contractors had left for the day, Richard finally walked outside again. He stood near what remained of the garage for several minutes, then slowly turned toward the street. For just a second, our eyes met. I honestly don't know whether he recognized me, or whether he simply happened to glance in our direction. His expression was impossible to read. He looked exhausted, defeated. Without saying a word, he turned around and went back inside. Dad sighed. I hope this doesn't ruin him financially. I looked over at him. Do you? Nobody deserves to lose that much money over a mistake. I thought about that for a moment, then quietly answered, No, they don't. But they also don't get to decide that the rules only apply to everyone else. Dad smiled, not because he necessarily agreed, but because he understood exactly what I meant. For years, he'd followed every requirement the city asked of him. When someone questioned his honesty, he proved everything with a folder full of permits. Richard had made a different choice, and now he was living with the consequences of that choice. As the sun began to set, I helped Dad carry a few empty flower pots into the garage. The legal garage, the one that had passed every inspection years ago, the one nobody had ever questioned until Richard arrived. Before I left, Dad walked me to my car. You know, I'm just glad the whole driveway situation is over. I smiled. Me too. He had absolutely no idea that the driveway complaint was the only reason I'd ever learned how easy it was to search public permit records. And I wasn't planning to tell him. Not now. Maybe not ever. Because despite everything that had happened, this had never been about revenge. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. By the following Monday, most of the contractors were gone. The construction trailer had disappeared. The piles of lumber had been hauled away. Even the orange safety cones were gone. If someone drove through our neighbourhood for the first time, they probably wouldn't notice anything unusual. But anyone who had lived there could tell immediately. Richard's garage no longer looked complete. The back corner was gone. The roofline ended abruptly where the city had required it to be shortened. Fresh framing and new siding made it obvious where the reconstruction had stopped. It wasn't ugly. It simply looked incomplete, like someone had erased part of the original plan. Every time I visited my parents after that, it was impossible not to notice it. Not because I was looking for it, because it stood out. Especially when you compared it to my dad's driveway. The very driveway that had started this entire chain of events. Perfectly straight, properly permitted. Exactly the same as it had been before the complaint. The only difference now was that everyone on the street knew it had passed a city inspection. Ironically, Richard's complaint had probably increased everyone's confidence that my dad had done everything correctly. One afternoon, while Dad and I were trimming bushes along the front walk, Mrs. Henderson wandered over, carrying a small basket of tomatoes from her garden. She smiled at Dad. "I heard the inspector cleared your driveway." Dad nodded. "Everything checked out." "I knew it would." She looked across the street for a brief moment before lowering her voice. I also heard about Richard's garage. Dad shrugged. Things happen. She gave him a curious look. You really aren't upset about what he did? Dad laughed softly. What would be the point? Being angry won't rebuild his garage. That was such a dad answer. Simple, practical, and probably healthier than anything going through my own head. Mrs. Henderson smiled. I suppose you're right. Before leaving, she added one sentence that stayed with me. Funny how people who spend all their time inspecting everyone else rarely expect anyone to inspect them. Dad chuckled. I guess that's true. Neither of them knew just how accurate those words really were. Over the next few weeks, something changed around the neighbourhood. Richard stopped taking his evening walks. At least, not the slow ones. The walks where he'd pause in front of every yard. The walks where he'd stand just a little too long, looking at people's fences or driveways. Now, he walked from his front door to his SUV. From the SUV, back to the house. That was about it. He kept his head down. He rarely looked toward anyone else's property anymore. One Saturday morning, Dad and I were washing his truck when Richard stepped outside. For a second, I thought he might come over. Instead, he simply unlocked his mailbox, grabbed a handful of letters, and quietly went back inside. No comments, no complaints, no suspicious glances, just silence. Dad watched him disappear into the house. I hope things settled down for him. I looked at Dad. You still feel sorry for him? Dad nodded without hesitation. I do. He made a mistake. He'll probably never make that mistake again. There it was, the difference between my father and me. He looked at the situation and saw a man who had learned an expensive lesson. I looked at it and saw a man who had finally experienced the same scrutiny he'd forced onto everyone else. Neither perspective was entirely wrong. They were simply different. A few days later, I found myself thinking back to the night I'd submitted that report. I'd spent 10 minutes staring at the screen before clicking submit. I'd asked myself over and over if I was doing the right thing. Even now, I wasn't completely sure. Would I have reported him if he had never gone after my dad? Honestly, probably not. That thought forced me to confront something uncomfortable. My decision hadn't come from nowhere. It had come after watching someone use the city's resources to harass a man who had done everything by the book. If Richard had simply minded his own business, I never would have opened the permit database. I never would have searched his address. I never would have noticed anything. He had unknowingly pointed me toward the very public records that eventually caused him so much trouble. Life has a strange sense of irony sometimes. You don't always create your own consequences directly. Sometimes you simply teach someone else where to look. One evening, as I was leaving my parents' house, I stopped for a moment at the end of the driveway. The street was quiet, children were riding bicycles, someone was mowing their lawn a few houses down. It felt like the neighbourhood had finally returned to normal. Peaceful, relaxed, exactly the way it had been before Richard arrived. I smiled to myself, not because someone had lost part of a garage, because the constant tension seemed to be gone. Sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't watching someone suffer. It's watching peace return after one person finally learns that the rules apply to them too. A few months have passed since everything happened. The neighbourhood feels different now, quieter. Not because people suddenly became best friends, but because everyone finally stopped waiting for the next complaint to arrive in their mailbox. Life simply returned to normal. Dad spends most mornings tending his garden. Mrs. Henderson still walks her little beagle every evening. Mr. Alvarez still parks his work van in front of his house after long shifts. Nobody seems worried about being watched anymore. The tension that had quietly settled over the neighbourhood eventually disappeared. Richard still lives across the street. We occasionally pass each other while I'm visiting my parents. Sometimes we nod, sometimes we don't. Neither of us has ever mentioned the city inspection, or the garage, or the driveway. It's as though none of it ever happened. Except, Every single day, the evidence is still there. My dad's driveway looks exactly the same as it always has. Smooth, level, completely legal. Across the street, Richard's garage tells a very different story. Even now, if you know what you're looking at, you can still see where the structure had been shortened. The siding is newer in one section. The roofline changes ever so slightly. Most people would never notice. I always do. Not because I'm proud of it, because I remember exactly why it's there. One afternoon, Dad and I were sitting on the porch drinking iced tea when he looked across the street. You know, I haven't seen any code enforcement trucks around here in a long time. I smiled. Probably a good thing. He nodded. I hope everyone's finally figured out how to get along. I almost laughed. Dad genuinely believed the entire situation had simply ended. He never connected the complaint against his driveway with the inspection at Richard's house. As far as he knew, they were completely unrelated. And honestly, I've never corrected him. A few friends have asked whether I'll ever tell him. The answer is probably not. Not because I think he'd be angry. Actually, I think he'd be disappointed. Not in me, but in the fact that things reached that point at all. My father has always believed that people should solve problems by talking first. He's the kind of man who still waves at every neighbour, even the difficult ones, even after everything that happened. I've inherited many things from him: his work ethic, his patience, his habit of keeping paperwork for far longer than most people would. But I didn't inherit all of his optimism. Because while Dad tends to believe everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt, I've learned that some people mistake kindness for weakness. Richard spent months looking for mistakes in everyone else's lives. He watched, he reported, he waited for someone to slip up. What he never expected was that someone might look just as carefully at his own property. I still remember staring at that online reporting form, wondering if I should submit it, wondering if I was crossing a line. Even today, I occasionally ask myself the same question. Would I make the same decision again? I honestly don't know. I'd like to believe I'd simply let it go. I'd like to believe I would have taken the higher road. But I also know something else. If Richard had never reported my dad, none of this would have happened. I never would have searched the permit database. I never would have looked up parcel maps. I never would have noticed his garage. His own complaint started the chain of events, not mine. Mine was simply the next link. Sometimes people say, revenge isn't worth it. Maybe they're right. But I don't really think this was revenge. I never lied. I never trespassed. I never damaged his property. I never made up accusations. I simply asked the city to verify whether a brand new structure had been built legally. The city did the rest. The inspectors measured. The inspectors checked the records. The inspectors made the decision. Not me. That's an important difference, because consequences only matter when they're based on facts, not emotions. Looking back now, the biggest lesson I took away from all of this had nothing to do with garages, or permits, or property lines. It was much simpler than that. If you're going to hold everyone else to the rules, you'd better make absolutely sure you're following them yourself. Otherwise, you may end up teaching someone exactly where to look. These days, whenever I visit my parents, I still park in the same driveway, the one Richard insisted couldn't possibly be legal. Every time I walk up to the front porch, I can't help but glance across the street. The garage is still there, smaller than it used to be. A permanent reminder that one anonymous complaint can sometimes uncover much more than anyone expected. Dad still doesn't know I was the one who filed the report. And maybe that's for the best, because this story was never really about proving I was right. It was about something my father taught me long before any of this happened. If you do things the right way, keep your records, follow the rules, and treat people fairly, You usually don't have much to fear when someone starts asking questions. The people who should worry are often the ones asking them.